Welcome.
Good to see
Yay.
you.
Hey.
I can't tell you how excited we are to have you here. Okay, I'm going to read your bio in case people don't know who you are, but literally we've been showing your videos and talking about you for the last 4 months, but also this morning. So, okay, Professor Richard Wolff is a Marxian economist and Professor of Economics Emeritus from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He is the host of Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff on WBAI, my old station, Fridays at 6:30, which is also syndicated over 70 radio stations nationwide, available for broadcast on Free Speech TV. Great place to go. And also you can just go on YouTube and Patreon and support all of Professor Wolff's work. Hi, Professor Wolff. How are you?
Very good. And how about you?
We're good. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot of people who have already put questions in that they want to ask you. So we're going to go through the questions that we have, and then maybe hopefully we'll have time. We'll definitely have time to ask questions. I'll squeeze our questions in so we can get everyone else in. And to my, I don't know, that side, this is Alex. He is a co-host on the program, coming all the way from Morocco.
Yeah.
Hey, Alex, how are you?
Hey, good. How are you? Pleasure to have you. I'm excited about the questions that people are going to have and hearing what you have to say. So.
All right, good.
So the Democratic Party still doesn't seem to have gotten it together enough to produce a concrete winner of the Iowa caucuses. But we do know that Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders, are going neck and neck. So what does that mean for us in terms of the economy? If either of those two candidates are to get a boost from these results, what questions do we need to be asking about their economic platforms? Here to help us assess both candidates' economic policy stances is Professor Richard Wolff. Welcome again to our Twitch platform.
Thank you very much. Let me make a couple of comments in trying to answer your question. Mr. Buttigieg is clearly trying to position himself in what is best called the Democratic center. Not as far over to the right of that center as Joe Biden, but clearly not as far over to the left of that center as Elizabeth Warren and, of course, Bernie Sanders. Bernie is the socialist candidate. You really don't have to say too much more because that distinguishes him from every other candidate in either party. And it means that Mr. Sanders represents something that everyone ought to think about. The previous two presidents ran as something fundamentally different from the old established American Tweedledum/Tweedledee politics. If you look at the Bush family or the Carters or the Clintons or the fill in the blank, it is a very slim difference between the two. They are all administering pretty much an identical foreign policy, and they are pretty much maintaining the system, the Republicans tilting towards the rich and the corporations, and the Democrats less so. But, and Buttigieg is clearly in that tradition, but to be fair to him, he's more left of center than he is right of center within the Democratic Party.
Well, that doesn't say much.
No, it doesn't say much. But let me mention, in case people don't know, I worked closely for quite a few years with his father, Joseph Buttigieg, who was a committed and a given Marxist and devoted all of his adult life to developing the work of an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci. He taught that as a professor at Notre Dame University in Indiana, and he was a leader of the International Gramsci Society, which is a very impressive organization holding conferences around the world on the important work of Antonio Gramsci as one of the leading Marxist theorists of the last century. So this is the son of that fellow. He knows very well what the left is, what a left position is, because his entire childhood was devoted to getting along, which he did well with his father. And you might want to think about that.
That is fascinating. We just read an article that he himself wrote and won some sort of prize when he was young, and well, he's still young, but much younger than he even is now. In 2000, it was Jacobin magazine published it today, and it was a glowing review of Bernie Sanders and his policies, and also his personal steadfastness in the face of having unpopular ideas, and his personal steadfastness in working across the aisle to get things done. So this is very interesting. Why doesn't he embrace that more in his campaign?
Well, I'm telling you this story because I think not only has he not embraced it, but he has gone out of his way not only to mention none of this, although I'm sure the researchers for Trump are getting ready to figure out all of these things and use it against him. But he has gone out of his way to be a centrist, to not embrace the kinds of ideas that Bernie Sanders does, to make himself the person who isn't Sanders, but is maybe a younger and less loaded with bad votes version of Mr. Biden, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what you're seeing is a recognition by the old established Democratic leadership, epitomized these days by the Clintons, that if Mr. Biden stumbles, which he clearly did in Iowa, they have to have a backup. They don't want to go to Elizabeth Warren because she is precisely further to the left than they want to go. And that leaves Mr. Buttigieg as the possibility for them to rally around. And I think that's what you're going to be seeing in the days ahead.
In our chat, we have E-Man 347 saying that he's not such a fan of Gramsci because he emphasizes culture over politics, which is flawed and, in quote, in my opinion, has created problems on the left. For people who aren't familiar with that argument and with Gramsci's argument, could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And let me politely disagree with your commentator there. Here's what Gramsci did and what is so, so important. Gramsci was caught up as an enormous admirer of the Russian Revolution in the effort to do the same thing in Italy. And it centered on an enormously important strike early in the 20th century at the Fiat plant in Torino in the north of Italy, or Turin in English, I guess. And that made Gramsci the great leader and the great popular figure, his enormous importance in organizing what was at that time the greatest industrial strike in Italian history. They basically shut down the city of Turin in support of the workers striking against the Fiat automobile company, one of the leading capitalists in Italy. And Gramsci was very successful, but in the end, the workers had to go back, and they had not succeeded in making the revolution like the counterparts had done in Russia. And so Gramsci asked himself with a kind of self-critical honesty, why? Why did they fail? Why were they, on the one hand, successful enough to mobilize the workers, on the other hand, not successful enough to bring it to a successful conclusion, both as a strike and as a way to change Italian society? And his answer was, and he spent the rest of his life trying to answer that question. His answer was that radical organizers, political organizers, union organizers like him had underestimated the power of culture and religion and all of that aspect of society to affect workers, to make workers hesitate when they needed to act, to make workers worry when they needed to have steadfastness, to break up the unity of workers. And so he devoted himself, and he could do the research, by the way, an important footnote, because he was arrested in the late teens of the 20th century by Mussolini, then the leader of Italy, sent to jail, spent the rest of his life in jail, inadequately attended to for medical care, and eventually released 3 or 4 months before he died. He was effectively killed by Mussolini, but he was in jail for, I think, 13 years or so. And during that time, he did the work that we have all used since to help political organizers understand the importance of culture and religion, and to understand that if you're going to mobilize people, you have to pay attention to what they think about music, to what they think about how to dress, to what they think about the religious commitments they may have, their morality, their art, because those things are as crucial in shaping people as the economic issues that they had focused on.
So that actually leads to a really great question. I'm going to ask you just to back up slightly from your camera.
Sorry.
There you go. That's better. We want to see all of you. So that's very good. Okay, so this is the question that I have for you. And it comes from Nacra Star, that and it fits in with this idea of, like, do we have the kind of society that could embrace a Bernie Sanders? The question is, a lot of people argue that a socialist candidate, and this is from one of our chat people, like Bernie can't win in a general election because the country's Overton window is too far right. What is your rebuttal to this point? And also, you know, if you can mix in a little of, like, our culture, is it ready? Like, I don't think people even know how to share. It's like insane.
I think we are ready, and let me tell you why. The disgust of the American people with conventional politics, with the Bush and the Clinton and all of that, was shown by the willingness of American people to do things all of that conventional politics had said wasn't possible. Let's start with Barack Obama. Nobody, or except for very few, thought that a Black American, an African American young man, could possibly become the president in the United States. Large numbers of our people still can't get over it. But it turned out to be wrong. It turned out that millions and millions of white Americans were so turned off by conventional politics that the very reality of Mr. Obama's obvious difference, namely the color of his skin, didn't matter anymore. They were willing to go and do something unthinkable earlier in the hope of the kind of change that they knew they needed. And Obama was smart. Remember the slogan? Hope and change. He understood. Okay, he turned out not to be the kind of change that people had hoped for. So they boomeranged the other way. They went to another guy, Mr. Trump, who was different too. He was obnoxious. He was a sexist. He was an ignoramus. He didn't know anything. He was a real estate hustler who had wasted most of the money his rich father had left for him. He was crude. He was disgusting. And all of the candidates said so. The very Lindsey Graham who supports him now, the Jeb Bush from Florida, whom he blew out of the race, even though that was the Bush family. He was different, and he made it clear. He begins his campaign by calling Mexicans rapists. He's showing everybody, oh boy, am I different from what you're used to. And many voters went for that again because it's different, and the thing that they had been promised to change hadn't come with Mr. Obama. Well, I got news for you. That's the same recognition building in the United States today. Mr. Trump has to go further and further in his outrageous behavior to hold on to the image of being different, Because the reality is he has given the tax cuts to corporations and the rich the way Republicans always do. He has supported every kind of deregulation of industry, which is what Republicans do. And the mass of the American people are not one iota better off. It's pathetic that the Democrats do not have the courage to say so. Let me just very quickly drive it home. We have the highest level of inequality we have seen in this country in a century. The level of debt carried by government, corporations, and people is worse today, just like the inequality is from what it was before. Mr. Trump has just announced $1 trillion deficit. Republicans used to say half of that was unbearable. He has, we have 1.5 million children homeless, falling behind in school in this country. I could go on all day. I don't want to do it, but he hasn't changed anything. Mm-hmm. And here comes the punchline. People now know that you got to be further different. You've got to be more different. Otherwise, they don't believe you're going to bring change. And Bernie Sanders' label of socialism, whatever exactly he means, and however people do or do not understand it, he is a kindly, smart, committed, elderly gentleman from Vermont who says, I'm going to do these things that are different. He may surprise you just as Mr. Trump surprised on the right and Mr. Obama surprised in terms of the legacy of racism in this country.
Bernie's economic plan seeks to democratize companies by redistributing economic and political rights within the firm away from external shareholders, something that you work on yourself, and executive management toward the workforce as a collective. Under Sanders, corporate boards would be democratized with at least 45% of the board of directors in any large corporation directly elected by the firm's workers. Meanwhile, Buttigieg's policies, they demonstrate this real keen awareness of racial, gender, sexual inequality, but he doesn't seem to address anything about the way capitalism produces and widens those disparities. Can you talk about what our country would look like if Bernie's economic plan, where corporate boards will be democratized, comes to bear? What are we looking at? What are the trickle up or down effects on our lives?
Well, part of what Sanders is reacting to, which should be a topic for all of the candidates, and it hasn't been, is the fact that over the last 50 years, we have destroyed one of the basic institutions in our society that made corporations at least a little bit accountable to the people, the majority. That institution is called the labor union. Let me just give you one statistic. 50 years ago, labor unions represented roughly a third of American workers. Today, they represent about 9% of American workers. They're gone. The ability of the labor union to shape, at least to some extent, what corporations do, to limit the decline in wages, to limit the taking away of benefits, to limit the insecurity of a job. Those institutional benefits for the mass of people have been lost because the unions have been destroyed in large part, not entirely, but in large part. The idea of giving workers the right to vote for members of the board of directors is a direct response by Mr. Sanders to this reality. Give back some of the power. And let's remember, the workplace is where we spend most of our adult lives. 5 out of 7 days, 9 to 5, we work. And we ought to have some say if we are ever to be a democratic society, which we've not been. But if we mean democracy, it should begin in the workplace because that's where we spend most of our time. We don't have it democratic. We have a tiny group of people at the top making all the decisions. All that Bernie is doing is saying that as a socialist, bringing some democracy back into the workplace is long overdue.
I like it. Alex has been keeping track of all of the questions coming in on the chat. I kind of peppered you with the ones that were just present, but we grabbed a bunch of questions from before. So Alex, can you maybe read Professor Wolff Oh, here they are. Okay, yeah, but you can do it.
Okay, cool. Let me find a good. I feel like you covered some of these already. So let's see. Lauren says, Professor, is the acquittal of President Trump and the backlash against Mitt Romney by the right wing evidence of the death of American democracy? If no, what would it take to start calling Trump a dictator?
And Lauren is coming to us from Australia. She's one of our most active participants, and she also keeps us abreast of how the whole country's on fire because she's kind of right in the middle of it.
It's true.
Insane.
Let me respond in two ways. Mr. Trump, well, I'll do the second one first. Mr. Trump would really like to be a dictator. You know, remember, this is the man who enjoys telling people you're fired. He doesn't want to have a conversation. He wants to be the big shot who makes the decision, and you slink away with no recourse, no accountability. He can tell you where to go. And it's the kind of fantasy of people who have no power in their lives and then want to imagine that they have an awful lot. This is an extraordinarily dangerous person to put in a position of power. We have many examples of dictators who, when you look at their history, were the oppressed and who only understood life to be a choice between being the bad one who gets trapped or abused or being the abuser. The idea of changing the system so you don't have to be one of those two hasn't occurred to them yet. So you're either a loser or a winner. It's a really bad human development. And yeah, he'd love to be a dictator. On the second part of the question, the American democracy. Well, there's no nice way to say this, so let me be blunt. We aren't a democracy. We haven't been. A democracy means that the people who live with a decision have the right to participate in making it. What we just finished discussing, Juliana and I, is that the workplace in a capitalist society is organized in a way, whether it's a store, a factory, or an office, where a tiny group of people, the owner of the business, the board of directors of the corporation, a tiny group make all the key decisions. They literally decide whether you keep the job or not, whether you have an income to sustain your family or not, whether you have to move, whether you have to yank your kids out of school to survive. All of these powerful, life-changing decisions are given to a tiny group of people in each workplace. All the rest of us have to live with a decision without being able to participate in making it. That's not a democracy. In fact, that's a textbook example of what democracy isn't. And we have in the United States, yes, 200 or 300 worker co-ops, which do have democracy in the workplace. But the typical business in this society isn't organized that way. And you can be sure that the Trump administration, like Republicans in general, have no plan for, no interest in, and no likelihood of changing that. And that's probably true also of most of the Democratic candidates, except you get a clear alternative from Bernie Sanders, and you get occasional hints of something different from Elizabeth Warren. Beyond that, no.
Professor Wolff, one of our comments was about how Chomsky is migrating to a serious pessimism that we can challenge the authority in a meaningful way. And the question was is really about, do you believe personally, and I know we've had conversations about the hopefulness that you sense just because of the popularity of your work and how far and wide your message is getting spread. Do you have a more hopeful approach, or are you like Chomsky, let's call it a day, it's over?
I'm very much the hopeful approach. You have read me right, Juliana. That's where I'm coming from. But let me give you 2 or 3 pieces of evidence that I think support this view. Number one, after an enormous amount of time and effort devoted to demonizing Bernie Sanders because he's a socialist and because he has these ideas, demonizing starting with the financial press, in which I read that all the time because of the work I do, in which there's this kind of crazy anxiety that if Mr. Sanders were to win, the stock market will fall apart, the economy will fall, all of that kind of fear mongering. Despite that, despite the direct attack of Hillary Clinton a few weeks ago, signaling what that part of the Democratic Party has to say about it, and all the other candidates going out of their way, including Elizabeth Warren, to say, I'm a capitalist, I love capitalism, all of that. What we just saw was the state of Iowa, as typical or atypical as any state in the United States. It has its particularities, but it's a genuine, regular part of this country. Mr. Sanders is either leading or is so close to Buttigieg that basically the people of Iowa have said, we're not frightened, we're not scared, we're voting in record numbers for a man who calls himself a socialist. This is an enormous development. And everybody who pays attention knows that the support for this socialist, and I'm not arguing about the different kinds of socialism here or how, that's another matter. But here is a socialist saying, I want your vote, and millions of Americans are saying, you got it, we like it, we want it. If you're not familiar with it, recent polls have shown that particularly young people, 35 and under, are very happy to consider themselves socialists, to favor socialism. The notion that this country is immune to all of that. Look, let me put it this way as a final point. Part of the reason you see the statements like Mr. Trump in the State of the Union message, that we'll never go socialist. This is the bravado of people who are scared. And let's all of us understand, you know what they're scared of? Not socialism, but the mass of Americans who are finding socialism every day more attractive because the capitalism they got is not what they need.
We have just a comment here. In the 6 months I've had to ingest your material, because I asked people where they got introduced with Professor Wolff, because pretty much everyone knows you who is watching. I've learned so much about socialism and I can't get enough. So thankful for his courage to stand up to the system that holds us all hostage. So I thought you might.
That is very sweet. Let me answer with a little personal vignette that may interest folks if they're familiar. I'm the product of the elite American university system. I don't normally talk about that, but it's relevant to what the kind comment you just read. So I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. Then I went to Stanford in California to get my master's degree in economics. And then I came back east and finished and got my PhD in economics at Yale. So look at me. I am a poster boy for elite education. That's what I am. 10 years of my life I spent in the Ivy Leagues. And during those 10 years, the best professors those folks had came at me to persuade me that capitalism is the best thing since sliced bread. And any attempt to go beyond it is either foolish or evil or both. And they did their level best. And among them were some really good teachers. But they failed. They didn't persuade me. And I would have been open to it. But they didn't. The counter arguments, which I had to go find myself, because none of those esteemed universities had the courage back then to give me a single professor who thought socialism was worth studying. I had to do it all on my own, along with the other students who did it with me. But I am the product of American capitalism. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. I've lived here all my life. I went to the best universities. I've lived capitalism. I've looked at socialism, and you get the result. But it's a result produced by American capitalism. I'm a product of that too. And that's another piece of evidence as to why this perspective, which is catching on beyond anything I had foreseen, is something one can be optimistic about.
Do you see any evidence that our universities are actually bringing in other, other things to read in their economics departments? I studied philosophy, and I know we did read some economic philosophy, which included Marx, but people who go to get philosophy degrees don't generally like start up the next AT&T. We're like, let me think about everything forever.
No, I have to respond by being brutally honest about my profession. I'm an economist. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life. Well, we are the most backward profession in the social sciences when it comes to being critical of capitalism, reading the great thinkers who developed alternative ideas, really studying the history of Russia and China and Cuba to get a sense of what they actually did, rather than reading screeds that demonize them. No, economics is very backwards in that regard and desperately tries to hold on. This is a profession which didn't see the crash of 2008 and 9, which has radically changed the world and given us, among other things, Mr. Trump or Mr. Johnson in England, or the leaders in Australia who can't smell a burning fire. This kind of problem. Well, my profession didn't see it coming. And my profession hasn't been able to fix it for 10 years because it doesn't study crises, because it needs to pretend that capitalism doesn't have them, even though we all go through them. So yeah, you'll find it in history, and you'll find it in anthropology, and in sociology, and in philosophy, and in political science even. But in economics, you're getting too close to the bone of capitalism, and they don't have the courage, with very few exceptions.
Professor Wolff, we've come to the end of our time with you, although I would like you to stay for the next hour. But I don't want to keep pressing our guests to stay beyond the time that we've asked them. I know you are very busy, and I do appreciate you being on with us. We were talking in the stream chat about how you have so many requests for appearances now that you have to make a choice. But like, do I still go on Fox and talk to the Fox people? Is it useful? And the people in the stream chat said that they believe that it's useful. Yes, that was their thought. So,
right. Well, the Fox folks have brought me a few times, and I will take that in advice. I want always to reach new audiences, and to my amazement, they're there and they're inviting me. And I just wish I had solved the problem of how to be in multiple places at the same time, but I haven't been able to do it.
the internet, you're here with us. You're literally in multiple places, because we have people in our chat from all over the world. So many people are texting in hearts and thank yous, and thanks for coming. I hope you'll join us again.
Absolutely. And I will, Juliana, because it's an important conversation, and because you have the courage to do this sort of thing. And I would be a very poor activist of the sort I think of myself as, if I didn't jump and to say to you, absolutely, I will do this again with you, and I'll look forward to it.
I'm sorry if we didn't get to all the questions in the chat. Next time Professor Wolff comes, we will ask him those questions about independent media that were out there. That's something I'm interested in hearing your response to as well. Always learn something, and I always enjoy our conversation. So thanks again for being on with us.
Same here, Juliana, and best wishes for this program. It's a wonderful thing that you're doing.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.